You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. I'm Daniel Sinner with today's discussion. This week, British Prime Minister David Cameron and his Deputy Prime Minister Nick Clegg reshuffled the cabinet for the very first time since taking office in 2010. The reshuffle of some of the most senior ministers in government comes amid a stalling economy, a series of policy U-turns and tensions over the expansion of Heathrow Airport. But the Prime Minister has been accused of creating a cabinet which is too white, too male, too rich and too right-wing. Although some of the key players are staying in place, the reshuffle means the public might see policy changes over health, justice and transport. Well, joining me for today's discussion is Dr. Mark Bannister, Senior Lecturer in Politics at Canterbury Christ Church University. Dr. Chris Hanratty is a lecturer in politics at the University of East Anglia. And Simon Woolley is Director of Operation Black Vote, an organisation that encourages minority communities to engage in politics. We'll begin with you, Dr. Mark Bannister. Has this been a successful reshuffle for Mr. Cameron and Mr. Clegg?
Well, reshuffles are notoriously difficult for prime ministers. Alistair Campbell talked about being an awful process. Tony Blair described it as ghastly. Clement Attlee said it was a distasteful thing to do. And even Margaret Thatcher said you grit your teeth before you do it. So it's really a mixed bag. I think most of the changes that are of real interest are underneath cabinet level. So they're really at the junior minister level. The other important thing about this reshuffle is that the Prime Minister's hands are pretty much tied in a lot of areas. There's not a lot of room for manoeuvre. So even though Baroness Varzi has been moved out, we've seen Ken Clarke being moved out of his position, and we've also had and Andrew Lansley has lost his job as Health Secretary. They still remain in the cabinet in some form. So they've not actually been fully sacked. There are also other areas where in coalition government where the Prime Minister has very little room for manoeuvre. There are 5 Lib Dem cabinet posts which have not been, which cannot be removed. So there's 5 posts that the Prime Minister cannot look at.
Simon Woolley from Operation Black Vote. Has the reshuffle been a success?
It's a fantastic lost opportunity. I mean, let's remember, over the last few weeks, we've been absolutely celebrating multicultural Olympics and Paralympics. We're saying to the world, this is who we are. This is what we want to show the whole world. And yet, when it comes to real power, when it comes to those that govern our country, we look at the cabinet and we see that 2/3 of the cabinet are from 2 elite colleges. This is a all-white cabinet. First time we've had an all-white cabinet in over 10 years. And it sends out the signal that unless you're white, male, and very privileged, there's not much space for you at the top table in British politics.
Dr. Chris Hanratty, has this been a good reshuffle?
I think it's more or less holding stations. I think this has been quite a limited reshuffle. As you said in the intro, we've waited quite a long time for this. It's the first reshuffle since 2010. Since that time, we've had a couple of ministerial resignations. Chris Huhne, David Laws, who's now back in government. But we've waited quite a long time, and we haven't really seen many changes at the top table. In terms of the cabinet, we've had 3 exits, 3 entries, and that's more or less the same number as the first Blair reshuffle, which took place only a year into that government. So I think it's really about holding stations at the top, and more of the action, as Mark has already said, is occurring at junior ranks.
If we go back to the low numbers of women and ethnic minorities in the cabinet, how important is it that Cameron puts in these thresholds, Dr. Chris Hanratty?
I think it's important to have some kind of target for female representation and black and ethnic minority representation. Because we've got to recognise that the current system so far is not meritocratic. People tend to appoint people who look like them. And that's the same in government, that's the same in business life, it's the same in academia. So these kinds of targets, of the kind that indeed the Prime Minister set for himself in terms of 1/3 female participation in government, are useful. And so far, they're not being achieved. So as you said, again, we've got a reduction in the number of female cabinet ministers. So instead of moving towards that target, which is useful, we're actually moving backwards.
Simon Woody from Operation Black Vote.
No, I mean, I think he's right. He's absolutely right. And the thing is about meritocracy is that we want the best people to do the job, and we're choosing from such a small pool of individuals that we're wasting a deluge of talent. And I come back to the Olympic Games because, you know, when you have a level playing field and we can all excel, then you see the great diversity coming to the top, as we've seen in the Olympic Games. And, you know, when we're talking about governance, when we're talking about education and health, and of course the recession that we'd like to get out of, we ought to be playing our best people to govern us in a way we can get out of this difficult economic climate.
Dr. Mark Bannister, if we take a look at the Department of Transport, Justine Greening has been moved to international development. She famously was against a third runway at Heathrow. Is this a sure sign that a change of government policy over Heathrow is expected?
I think it's very difficult to disagree with that. It's interesting that under the coalition, we've seen more stability, and as you noted in your introduction, that there's been this is the first major reshuffle. There was at the outset there was a desire for more stability and ministers to remain in post. However, transport is the exception there. I think we've seen 7 different transport secretaries in the past 9 years. So this is a clear signal. I think that they want to, the government wants to open up the discussion, at least over new runway at Heathrow. The trouble for the government, certainly the trouble for David Cameron, is going to be this has really stirred Boris Johnson up. So,
in many respects, that was probably the bravest decision that the Prime Minister made, because he knows he's going against his mayor in London, who is a prominent figure, and the Tory heartland around Heathrow. But he said, look, British business needs to expand its hubs in central London, and so he opened up the discussion. That, to me, was bravery. I think that where he lost a trick here is that people like Lord Ashcroft, who many years have in part bankrolled the Conservative Party, have said to David Cameron, and no uncertain terms, that to win the next election, you need the black vote in a number of crucial seats. I mean, they've outlined about 50 seats in which the black vote could decide whether they win or lose. And yet, right at the crucial moment, when he could have really, in some ways, put down those detractors who don't like Baroness Sayeda Varsi, and said, look, diversity works. We want to show a multicultural team. We want to bring others in too, like Adam Mafria and Helen Grant. He could have faced them down. And so, in terms of the Heathrow, he was brave. But in terms of facing down those detractors that don't want a multicultural team, I think he missed the trick.
But Dr. Mark Bannister, the former party chairman, Michael Fallon, went on Newsnight the evening of the reshuffle and said that the government won't change its stance on Heathrow.
And David Cameron is very aware of this, and he said himself he doesn't want to see the split screen images of himself saying one thing a few years earlier and saying something different now. So they've managed to open up a debate and then park it really until after the next election, when I'm sure it will probably appear in the Conservative manifesto. But they've dealt with one major obstacle in terms of just moving Justine Greening. I think I'm not sure about how brave that decision was in terms of moving somebody who's been an outspoken woman in the cabinet. I'm not sure about the bravery about that as such. And I think he may be storing up quite a bit of trouble in terms of Boris Johnson, because certain Conservatives are starting to coalesce around Boris Johnson.
But surely he would have known that.
Yes, he would have been aware of this, and certainly coming back to the Olympics, obviously Boris has had a good Olympics.
A reminder that you're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. I'm Daniel Sinner with today's discussion on the Cabinet Reshuffle. Joining me for today's discussion is Dr. Mark Bannister, Senior Lecturer in Politics at Canterbury Christ Church University. Dr. Chris Hanratty is a lecturer in politics at the University of East Anglia, and Simon Woolley is Director of Operation Black Vote, an organisation that encourages minority communities to engage in politics. Dr. Chris Hanratty from the University of East Anglia, we look at the new Transport Secretary, a man who's scared of flying but a straight-talking northerner, an ex-miner, but someone who can talk to voters about the cost of rail fares and petrol.
He seems to be someone who's been brought in because of his loyalty or potential to deliver loyalty. He's been a chief whip for the longest time, rarely speaks in Parliament, so it's quite a mystery as to how he fits within the party. So I think he's really there to deliver loyalty. And I think that's been also one of the motifs of the reshuffle, that those who have been loyal have been rewarded. And I'm sure later we're going to come on to discuss Jeremy Hunt. And he's certainly taken a lot of flack, but has been a good soldier. And so whilst many might have expected him to have moved from culture and media sports and go out of the cabinet, he's in fact been moved over.
He took a bullet. He took a bullet for David Cameron during the Leveson inquiry, because had he have not held that line, then it's quite plausible that the government may have imploded. I mean, it was a big issue. It was right at the doorstep of Downing Street, and Hunt held the line. And a lot of people feel that it's completely incredulous that here is a man at the centre of what is a debacle for the government to be rewarded with a promotion.
I mean, certainly if any of us had predicted 6-9 months ago that Jeremy Hunt would be moved to health, we would have been laughed out of the room.
When he came out to Downing Street and he said, "This is the greatest moment of my life," it was almost as though he was as shocked as anybody else, because he couldn't believe his luck. Here was a man who was hanging on for dear life to have the greatest promotion that we've seen during this government.
And I think a number of papers splashed with that wonderful photo of him going into number 10 with his arms raised and a huge shrug and a big beaming smile on his face, as if, what, me?
I think Chris makes a very important point here, though. If we're looking for themes in this reshuffle, loyalty is probably an important theme. If we're halfway through this government's term of office, and we can see that certain loyal ministers are being rewarded, and some more independent-minded cabinet ministers have been shuffled out of their position. Andrew Lansley, Ken Clarke, of course, Baroness Varzi too. So, and we can see their replacements are, we don't know yet, but they're being rewarded for their loyalty, and that could be a theme in terms of creating a more cohesive Conservative Party. But that in itself is, I think, going to cause some more difficulty with the Liberal Democrats in terms of their relationship. They won't have as many potentially more liberal members of the Conservative Party around them.
Dr. Chris Hanratty, Jeremy Hunt has now been moved into health, a department held by Andrew Lansley, who spent 8 years learning about the NHS, only to be taken over by someone who's never expressed an interest in the department before.
Well, there's a long-standing tradition in British government that ministers needn't have specialist experience in their briefs. It's the cult of the talented amateur. I'm sure Jeremy Hunt is as capable as the next government minister of picking up and reading a brief quickly and acting on it. And fortunately for him, the only way to go is up, since the health reforms are hardly popular. So anything he does might be an improvement.
Simon Woolley from Operation Black Vote. Is this a Prime Minister who wants one person to propose changes to the NHS and another one to implement it?
Well, I think the medical profession have said there's an opportunity here for us. I mean, they see it as something that they can renegotiate with a new minister. And so Hunt finds himself in a privileged position because he's got people all around him that want to have a progressive conversation. But I think overall that has been stated by my colleagues here that it has been, if you like, not a negative reshuffle, but a holding one. And I think what a lot of people would have wanted to see is something more dynamic, more progressive, that says that it's difficult. But we're going to tackle the pressing decisions and challenges that need to be looked at.
It's fair to say that that kind of dynamism would also have had costs for the government. So I look at some of the junior ministers and I think, okay, there are some interesting characters there who I think will go quite far in government.
Yes.
But the problem is that this Parliament so far has been one of the most rebellious parliaments ever. So there's a big problem in managing backbench rebellion, and there's always going to be a difficulty in placating people. If you promote very quickly a lot of the exciting 2010 intake, then you're going to cause problems for yourself with those who haven't been promoted, who feel that their generation has been skipped over.
Well, I wanted to come in on the how this may play out with the party, because I think we're going to. I agree with Chris that the Conservative Party backbenchers have been very rebellious, and they're likely to be more so because, as was stated at the top, this may potentially be the only major reshuffle of this government. So for a lot of Conservative members on the backbenchers, their chances of getting a job in government are now finished. So that we may see more rebellion, which explains why the Whip's office has been bolstered and there's been a big turnover of members of the Whip's office. So we can see that the government knows that they're going to be storing up quite a bit of trouble there.
I have to say that on that, with the backbench MPs and junior ministers, I mean, for us within the black community, it's double-edged because the only two black and minority ethnic ministers, Sayeeda Varsi and Helen Grant, come from our organisation. Helen Grant was an alumni, was on our MP shadowing scheme, and Sayeeda Varsi helped us launch this scheme up in the north, so we take credit for that. But there are other MPs, very talented MPs, such as Adam Afriya. Now, he was one of the first intake of Conservative MPs back in 2005, a shadow minister whilst in opposition, given nothing. Now, talented individuals such as him must be seething, particularly watching Helen Grant overtake him, and they may say, "Look, it's time for us to speak out."
Absolutely, I had a quick look at the new ministers, and it seems that the 2010 intake has been promoted above the troublesome 2005 intake. That's a broad generalisation, but it seems that those that owe their position to the Conservatives being the largest party in 2010 have been rewarded, whereas many MPs have been overlooked, and they now know that they may be overlooked for the rest of the term of the government. So there's going to be a lot more problems. I think the way the government has tried to address this has perhaps been having a rightward shift, or the perception of a rightward shift in terms of some of the appointments. Chris Grayling that you mentioned, Owen Paterson as well. We could see a shift in terms of environment policy to a more perhaps climate change. Sceptic policy, we can see a harder line on we were certainly likely to see a harder line on justice from predecessor Ken Clarke. So I think the way that David Cameron and George Osborne have tried to address the problems they may have is to signal we're going to move a little bit to the right whilst we stay on our economic course.
A reminder that you're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. I'm Daniel Sinner with today's discussion on the Cabinet reshuffle. Joining me for today's discussion is Dr. Mark Bannister, Senior Lecturer in Politics at Canterbury Christ Church University. Dr. Chris Hanratty is a lecturer in politics at the University of East Anglia. And Simon Woolley is Director of Operation Black Vote, an organisation that encourages minority communities to engage in politics. If we move on to the Department of Justice, Chris Grayling taking over, replacing a man who famously said, Theresa May locks them up and I let them out. Are we going to see a harder line on justice?
That certainly seems like a possibility, but a lot of the Liberal Democrats have said we're going to be watching Chris Grayling like a hawk. So anything he does will have to be squared off with his Liberal Democrat junior minister.
I was surprised that Nick Herbert got moved or sacked, or asked to leave from the Home Office. I mean, he was in charge of policing. He took a very tough line on policing, particularly in regards to our agenda, in which, we were asking the Home Office to abandon the kind of racial profiling and stop and search, which were factors in last year's riots. And he was belligerent in his response, saying that the police need the powers to do what they need to do, and he's gone, which is, for us, is a big relief.
Do you welcome Chris Grayling's appointment?
Well, I mean, the flip side is that it seemed to me that in many respects, Kenneth Clarke was reasonably progressive, and he did want to sit back and look at things in a reasonable way. So it's the jury's out, I guess.
Simon Woolley from Operation Black Vote. This is someone who will be tougher on EU rulings. He doesn't want an overzealous culture on human rights. How worrying is this for you?
Well, it's worrying for Operation Black Vote, but it's also worrying. I'm also a commissioner for the Equality and Human Rights Commission. And, I'm sure we've got a meeting this afternoon, and I'm sure we'll be looking at the landscape, the political landscape, and saying, what does this hold for us?
And what does it hold?
Well, on the positive side, again, one of our alumni, Helen Grant, will head up equalities, women and equalities. That should be a good thing. We can have a good conversation with her. But, in terms of, I think that civil society has a crucial role to play in saying to the government, look, these are the red lines. Human rights are for everyone, young and old, disabled, abled, and they're not, as the Daily Mail would say, for prisoners and terrorists. So the civil society has to hold them to account, and that's going to be a tough job, though.
Dr. Mark Bannister, Senior Lecturer in Politics at Canterbury Christ Church University.
Yes, I think something we need to remember a little bit in terms of talking about the position, in terms of the Justice Secretary position, is that this was actually offered to Ian Duncan Smith, and who, whilst he's perceived to be largely on the right of the party, is more of an independent-minded and it could potentially have been more progressive in that position. Now we're pretty certain, judging from the media reports, that he turned down that position to stay in his current post, which was seen as a bit of a defeat for George Osborne, but also in terms of following Ken Clarke, there may have been a continuing progressive agenda. We don't know, but we do know that Chris Grayling is likely to have a much tougher line in a lot of areas. And I think Nick Herbert was mentioned as a junior minister. My understanding is that he resigned before the reshuffle. And my understanding was that was because he couldn't get the policing reform that he wanted through, and was dissatisfied with the support for police commissioners. So it'll be interesting to see what happens with the police commissioners, whether that initiative is quietly shelved, perhaps.
Oh, it's happening. It's happening. I mean, we're going to elections in November, so we will have police commissioners now.
I guess there's a certain number of amount of alarm about who's now standing for the police commissioner. So the government might be not quite so happy with it might be the law of unintended consequences here in terms of.
I think they're worried. They're worried that the public won't respond to very much to these elections, and that it'll be seen as another government failure. But the commissioners will be there.
Now, as we come to the end of this discussion, I wanted to hear from all of you about your predictions for the success of this new cabinet. Do you think they'll last until the next general election?
Well, I've gone on record as saying that I don't think this government is going to last the full 5-year term. And I think what we've seen with this reshuffle is really two mini reshuffles, a Conservative mini reshuffle, which has meant that the Conservative Party in government has moved to the right, a smaller Lib Dem mini reshuffle with Lib Dems in government now really trying to keep an eye on what the Conservative ministers are doing. And I can only see the tension between the parties increasing from now on.
Simon Woolley from Operation Black Vote.
I think both parties in the coalition have got one eye on the general election. And I think we've seen that with resignations from Liberal Democrats leaving government to really shore up their very vulnerable seats. And I think that the Conservative shift to the right is really saying to their core voters in this is that we're on your side. We're proper Conservatives, and that's a clear message. You know, I think that there'll be 18 months of policies and policy changes, if you like, but thereafter, now and increasingly thereafter, it's all about the election.
And finally, Dr. Mark Bannister.
I agree with Simon that we're starting to see the one eye from both parties, both coalition parties on the election. I used to think that the coalition wouldn't last full term. I've changed my mind now. I think this reshuffle shows that the Conservatives have been very clever, very shrewd about how to manage coalition government. I think we're at a staging post here where we've had a whole raft of policy initiatives that have come in health, in welfare reform and in education, and we're now looking at implementation around desperately trying to get the economy moving again. I think this reshuffle demonstrates that the struggle they're having with that, and I think this reshuffle shows that there may not be any great turnaround of the economy in the short term. I'm not sure about the tensions between the Liberal Democrats. I think they're firmly put in their place here. Lords reform's not going to happen. Electoral reform isn't going to happen. So they have nowhere else to go, except, of course, oblivion at the next election.
Well, unfortunately, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you to all of my guests. Dr. Mark Bannister, Senior Lecturer in Politics at Canterbury Christ Church University. Dr. Chris Hanratty, a Lecturer in Politics at the University of East Anglia. And Simon Woolley, Director of Operation Black Vote, an organisation encouraging minority communities to engage in politics.
This is the voice of Russia.
A mixed bag. I think most of the changes that are of real interest are underneath cabinet level. So they're really at the junior minister level. The other important thing about this reshuffle is that the Prime Minister's hands are pretty much tied in a lot of areas. There's not a lot of room for manoeuvre. So even though Baroness Varsi has been moved out, we've seen Ken Clarke being moved out of his position, and we've also had and Andrew Lansley has lost his job as Health Secretary. They still remain in the cabinet in some form. So they've not actually been fully sacked. There are also other areas where in coalition government where the Prime Minister has very little room for manoeuvre.
There's not much space for you at the top table in British politics.
Dr. Chris Hanratty, has this been a good reshuffle?
I think it's more or less holding stations. I think this has been quite a limited reshuffle. As you said in the intro, we've waited quite a long time for this. It's the first reshuffle since 2010. Since that time, we've had a couple of ministerial resignations. Chris Huhne, David Laws, who's now back in government. But we've waited quite a long time, and we haven't really seen many changes at the top table. In terms of the cabinet, we've had 3 exits, 3 entries, and that's more or less the same number as the first Blair reshuffle, which took place only a year into that government. So I think it's really about holding stations at the top, and more of the action, as Mark has already said, is occurring at junior ranks.
If we go back to the low numbers of women and ethnic... Well, joining me for today's discussion is Dr. Mark Bannister, Senior Lecturer in Politics at Canterbury Christ Church University. Dr. Chris Hanratty is a lecturer in politics at the University of East Anglia, and Simon Woolley is Director of Operation Black Vote, an organisation that encourages minority communities to engage in politics. We'll begin with you, Dr. Mark Bannister. Has this been a successful reshuffle for Mr. Cameron and Mr. Clegg?
Well, reshuffles are notoriously difficult for prime ministers. Alistair Campbell talked about being an awful process. Tony Blair described it as ghastly. Clement Attlee said it was a distasteful thing to do, and even Margaret Thatcher said you grit your teeth before you do it. So it's really...
You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. I'm Daniel Sinner with today's discussion. This week, British Prime Minister David Cameron and his Deputy Prime Minister Nick Clegg reshuffled the cabinet for the very first time since taking office in 2010. The reshuffle of some of the most senior ministers in government comes amid a stalling economy, a series of policy U-turns and tensions over the expansion of Heathrow Airport. But the Prime Minister has been accused of creating a cabinet which is too white, too male, too rich and too right-wing. Although some of the key players are staying in place, the reshuffle means the public might see policy changes over health, justice and transport.
There are 5 Lib Dem cabinet posts which have not been, which cannot be removed. So there's 5 posts that the Prime Minister cannot look at.
Simon Woolley from Operation Black Vote. Has the reshuffle been a success?
It's a fantastic lost opportunity. I mean, let's remember, over the last few weeks, we've been absolutely celebrating multicultural Olympics and Paralympics. We're saying to the world, this is who we are. This is what we want to show the whole world. And yet, when it comes to real power, when it comes to those that govern our country, we look at the cabinet and we see that 2/3 of the cabinet are from 2 elite colleges. This is a all-white cabinet. First time we've had an all-white cabinet in over 10 years. And it sends out the signal that unless you're white, male, and very privileged,